of the greatest action scene inside the octagon in the history of the UFC.
Stephan Bonnar and Forrest Griffin waged an epic war of mixed martial arts history.
Randy Couture versus Brock Lesnar for the UFC heavyweight title of the world. That might be the biggest fight in mixed martial arts history.
You're going to see one of the worst grudge matches in UFC history.
It's the most anticipated rematch in UFC history. It's the biggest night in UFC history.
In one of the biggest grudge matches in UFC history.
In the biggest physical matchup and the biggest promotional matchup in UFC history. The biggest fight, literally, in the history of the division.
The greatest fight in UFC history.
Facing off in the biggest fight, literally, in the history of the division.
That might be one of the greatest comebacks in the history of the UFC.
And one of the most anticipated rematches in the history of this sport.
The biggest rematch in the history of the business.
John Jones versus the greatest trash talker in combat sports history.
Is the most exciting trilogy in UFC heavyweight history.
You think that was the best fight card in UFC history?
Yeah.
Weidman and Anderson Silva.
It will be the biggest fight in UFC history.
This is one of the most anticipated fights, I believe, in UFC history.
I think it really is one of the biggest matchups in UFC history.
That was one of the greatest championship battles in the history of this division.
Dude, do you understand what we're about to watch? In some ways, the most anticipated fight in UFC history.
And who better to headline the UFC's biggest event in history than the UFC's biggest star?
The most highly anticipated featherweight fight of all time.
UFC 200 is an enormous historic event. They are putting on one of the greatest cards in the history of the sport.
It's the biggest, baddest card in UFC history.
This is the big one. This is the biggest card in the history of combat sports, the biggest card in the history of mixed martial arts. The greatest card in the history of the sport has come to New York City.
And it will be the biggest fight ever in the history of two people punching each other.
This is the biggest fight ever in combat sports history.
This will be the biggest event ever.
And the most exciting heavyweight world title fight ever.
This is the scariest man in the history of the sport.
In my opinion, it's the biggest fight in UFC history.
And I believe that this is the biggest fight in the history of the company. This thing is going to be massive.